But remember, the Russians invaded Afghanistan back in 1980. And although no country went in, they certainly had a lot of countries supplying arms and advice and even some advisors to those who were recruited to fight Russia. It didn't end well for the Russians. There were other unintended consequences, as we know. But the fact is that a very motivated and then funded and armed insurgency basically drove the Russians out of Afghanistan. Obviously, the similarities are not ones that you should bank on, because the terrain, the development in urban areas, et cetera, is so different. But I think that is the model that people are now looking toward. And if there can be sufficient armaments that get in, and they should be able to get in along some of the borders between other nations and Ukraine, and keep the Ukrainian, both their military and their citizen volunteer soldiers supplied, that can continue to stymie Russia. Now, let's be clear that Russia has overwhelming military force. But of course, they did in Afghanistan as well. They also brought a lot of air power to Syria. It took years to finally defeat Syria in terms of the insurgencies, the democratic forces, as well as others who battled the Russians, the Syrians, and the Iranians. So if you're fighting for your homeland, you're fighting for your family, you're fighting for your ideals, that's far more powerful than sending in these poor, young Russian soldiers who didn't even know where they were going until they crossed the border and people were screaming at them and they realized they were in Ukraine. So I think we have to watch this carefully. We have to provide sufficient military armaments for the Ukraine military and volunteers. And we have to keep tightening the screws.
Under the leadership of Nur Mohammad Taraki, communists had seized power in Afghanistan on April 27, 1978. The newly formed Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, which was divided between Taraki's extremist Khalq faction and the more moderate Parcham, the opposition, had signed a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union in December of that year. However, shortly thereafter, Taraki's efforts to improve secular education and redistribute land were accompanied by mass executions, including many conservative religious leaders, and political oppression unprecedented in Afghan history ignited a revolt by the Afghan Mujahideen rebels. By 1977, Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor, forms the Nationalities Working Group, the NWG, dedicated to the idea of weakening the Soviet Union by inflaming its ethnic tensions. The Islamic populations are regarded as prime targets. Richard Pipes, the father of Daniel Pipes, takes over the leadership of the NWG in 1981. Pipes predicts that with the right encouragement, Soviet Muslims will explode into genocidal fury. According to Richard Cotton, a former CIA official who advised the Carter administration at the time, after the fall of the Shah of Iran in 1978, Brzezinski favored the de facto alliance with the forces of Islamic resurgence and with the Republic of Iran. On December 26, 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan after Taraki is arrested. They will withdraw 10 years later after a brutal 10-year war. It has been commonly believed that the invasion was unprovoked. However, in a 1998 interview, Zbigniew Brzezinski will reveal that the CIA began destabilizing the pro-Soviet Afghan government 6 months earlier in a deliberate attempt to get the Soviets to invade and have their own Vietnam-type costly war. Brzezinski rhetorically asks, what is more important to the history of the world, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Some stirred-up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War? The United States and Saudi Arabia give a huge amount of money to support the Mujahideen guerrilla fighters opposing the Russians throughout the war. Most of the money is managed through the Pakistan intelligence agency, the ISI. By 1981, Osama bin Laden begins providing financial, organizational, and engineering aid for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan with the advice and support of the Saudi royal family. Some, including Richard Clarke, the counterterrorism czar during the Clinton and Bush administrations, believe he was handpicked for the job by Prince Turki Al Faisal, head of Saudi Arabia's Secret Service, the General Intelligence Directorate. The Pakistan ISI want the Saudi prince as a public demonstration of the commitment of the Saudi royal family and as a way to ensure royal funds for the anti-Soviet forces. The agency fails to get royalty, but bin Laden, with his family's influential ties, is good enough for the ISI. Months later, Afghan opium production rises from 250 tons in 1982 to 2,000 tons in 1991, coinciding with CIA support and funding of the Mujahideen. Drugs is most commonly used for the black operations of the intelligence agencies. Alfred McCoy, a professor of Southeast Asian history at the University of Wisconsin, said that the United States and Pakistan intelligence officials sanctioned the rebels' drug trafficking because of their fierce opposition to the Soviets. If their local allies were involved in narcotics trafficking, it didn't trouble the CIA. They were willing to keep working with people who were heavily involved in narcotics. For instance, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar of the Hizib-i-Islami received about half of all the CIA's covert weapons and was known to be a major heroin trafficker. Charles Cogan, who directs the CIA's operation in Afghanistan, would later claim that he was unaware of the drug trade, but that they found out about it later on. 2 years later, in 1984, bin Laden moved to Peshawar, which is a Pakistan town bordering Afghanistan, and helps run a front organization for the Mujahideen, influenced by his mentor, a Palestinian imam, Abdullah Yusuf Azam, and an Algerian, Abdullah Anas. The organization was known as the Maktab al-Khidmat, or the Afghan Services Bureau, which was to provide money, arms, and fighters from the outside world into the Afghan war. The MAC officers nurtured by Pakistan's state security services, the Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, and the CIA's primary conduit for conducting the covert war against Moscow's occupation. Bin Laden becomes closely tied to Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and greatly strengthens Hekmatyar's opium smuggling operations. Hekmatyar, who also has ties with bin Laden, the CIA, and drug running, has been called a Pakistan ISI creation. The United States, through the USAID and the University of Nebraska, would spend millions of dollars developing and printing textbooks for Afghan school children. The textbooks are filled with violent images and militant Islamic teachings, part of covert attempts to spur resistance to the Soviet occupation. For instance, children are taught to count with illustrations showing tanks, missiles, and landmines. Lacking any alternative, millions of these textbooks are long used after 1994. The Taliban are still using them in 2001. By 2002, the United States will start producing less violent versions of the same books, in which President Bush would later say, respect for human dignity instead of indoctrinating students with fanaticism and bigotry. He would also conveniently forget to mention who created those earlier books. The ISI started a special cell of agents who used profits from heroin production for covert actions at the assistance of the CIA by 1985. This cell promotes the cultivation of opium and the extraction of heroin in Pakistani and Afghan territories under Mujahideen control. The heroin is then smuggled into the Soviet control areas in an attempt to turn the Soviet troops into heroin addicts. After the withdrawal of the Soviet troops, the ISI's heroin cell started sharing its network and started to refine and smuggle this heroin to the Western countries, which are the United States, and using the money as a supplement to its legitimate economy. But for those heroin dollars, Pakistan's legitimate economy must have collapsed many years ago. The ISI grows so much powerful on this money that even by the shadowy standards of spy agencies, the ISI is notorious. It is commonly branded a state within a state, or Pakistan's invisible government. According to controversial author General Posner, an ex-CIA official claimed that General Akhtar Abdul Rahman, Pakistan's ISI head from 1980 to 1987, regularly meets with bin Laden in Peshawar. The ISI and bin Laden form a partnership that forces Afghan tribal warlords to pay a tax on the opium trade. By 1985, bin Laden and the ISI were splitting annual profits of up to $100 million a year. Within the summer months of '85, Sheikh Abdullah Azam makes repeated trips to the United States and other countries, building up the Maktab al-Khidmat. Branches of the MAC office began to open up in over 30 US cities, with an actual office located in Brooklyn, New York, the Al-Khifa Refugee Center. Some US intelligence officials believe that the CIA, along with the FBI, have begun monitoring the Al-Khifa Refugee Center and began looking at closely the ex-Afghan Mujahideen who relocated to Brooklyn after the war. By March of 1986, the CIA and the British intelligence agency, the MI6, agreed to launch guerrilla attacks from Afghanistan into then Soviet-controlled Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, attacking military installations, factories, and storage depots within Soviet territory, and do so until the end of the war. The CIA also gives subversive literature and Qurans to the ISI, who carry them into the Soviet Union. According to Australian journalist Tom Pilger, CIA Director William Casey gives his backing to a plan put forward by the Pakistan's ISI to recruit people from around the world to join the Afghan jihad. More than 100,000 Islamic militants are trained in Pakistan between 1986 and 1992 in camps overseen by the CIA, MI6, and the ISI, which included British Special Forces, SAS, training future Al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters in bomb making and other black arts. Their leaders are trained at a CIA camp in Virginia. The operation is known as Operation Cyclone. While the operation is originally designed to defeat the Soviets in Afghanistan, it continues for several years after the Soviets leave Afghanistan in 1989. Eventually, around 35,000 Muslim radicals from 43 Islamic countries will fight with the Afghan Mujahideen. Tens of thousands more will study in the hundreds of new madrasas funded by the ISI and CIA in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Their main logistical base is in the Pakistan city of Peshawar. Ironically, although many are trained, it seems only a small percentage actually take fight in serious fighting in Afghanistan, so their impact on the war is small. Richard Murphy, Assistant Secretary of State of Near East and South Asian Relations during the Reagan administration, will later say, "We did spawn a monster in Afghanistan. Once the Soviets were gone, the people trained or funded by the United States CIA were looking around for other targets, and Osama bin Laden had settled on the United States as the source of all evil. Irony? Irony is all over the place." By the late 1980s, Pakistan President Benazir Bhutto, feeling the Mujahideen network had grown too strong, would later tell President George H.W. Bush that "you have created a Frankenstein that will reap havoc not just in the Middle East, but also inside the United States." However, her warning goes unheeded. By 1993, President Bhutto would tell Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak that Peshawar is under de facto control of the Mujahideen, and unsuccessfully asks for military help in reasserting Pakistan control over the city. Thousands of Mujahideen fighters returned to their home countries after the war was over and engaged in multiple acts of violence. One Western diplomat notes, "These thousands would never have been trained or united without the CIA's help," and says the consequences for all of us are astronomical. They would later form groups such as Al-Qaeda, Abu Sayyaf, Boko Haram, Jaish-e-Mohammed, and Jemaah-Islamiyah. Worried that the Soviets are winning the war in Afghanistan, the United States decides to train and arm the Mujahideen with Stinger missiles. The Soviets are forced to stop the attack helicopters that were being used for devastating effect. Some claim the Stingers turned the tide of the war and lead directly to Soviet withdrawal. However, the Mujahideen are better trained and armed than ever before. Some would later say that even the same RPG and Stinger missiles that were given to the Mujahideen were later used to shoot down Black Hawk helicopters in Somalia in 1992. By September of 1987, Michael Springman, head of the United States consular official in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, later claims that during this period, he's repeatedly told to issue visas to unqualified applicants. He repeatedly turns them down, but is also repeatedly overruled by his superiors. Springman loudly complains to numerous government offices, but no action is taken. He is fired, and his files on these applicants are destroyed. He later learns that recruits from many countries fighting for bin Laden against Russia in Afghanistan were funneled through the Jeddah office to get visas to come to the United States, where the recruits would travel to train for the Afghan war. According to Springman, the Jeddah consulate was run by the CIA and staffed almost entirely by intelligence assets. This visa system may have continued at least through 9/11, where 15 of the 19 9/11 hijackers received their visas through Jeddah, possibly as part of this program. By August 11th, 1988, bin Laden conducts a meeting to discuss the establishment of a new military group, and according to notes that are found later called the Harmony documents, over time, this group became known as Al-Qaeda, roughly meaning the base or the foundation. Most of these Arab Mujahideen fighters were trained at the Al-Masada, which is also known as the Lion's Den, located in the Paktia province of Afghanistan. where notable guerrilla fighters, partly because they couldn't train in Afghan training camps, went here. All of the applicants that are in this camp are foreign Arabs. Most of these people would later become part of Al-Qaeda. On February 15, 1989, Soviet forces withdraw from Afghanistan, but Afghan communists retain control of Kabul, the capital, until April of 1992. It is estimated that more than 1 million Afghans, 8% of the country's population, were killed in the war, and hundreds of thousands had been maimed by an unprecedented number of landmines. Almost half of the survivors of the war are refugees. Richard Clarke would later claim that the huge amount of the United States aid coming from the CIA provided to Afghanistan drop off drastically as soon as the Soviet withdrawal, which abandoned the country to 2 civil wars and complete chaos and utter destruction. The new powers in Afghanistan are tribal chiefs, the Pakistan ISI and the Arab war veterans coalescing into Al-Qaeda, and also a new group that came out of the madrasas in Pakistan, headed by a one-eyed insurgent named Muhammad Mullah Omar, the Taliban. This would help to create a new enemy that was facilitated by the CIA, Saudi billionaire donors, and the Pakistan ISI. One of those people was Osama bin Laden.
You have declared a jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
The US government has committed acts that are extremely unjust, hideous, and criminal through its support of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And we believe the US is directly responsible for those killed in Palestine, Lebanon, and Iraq. Due to its subordination to the Jews, the arrogance of the United States regime has reached the point that they occupied Arabia, the holiest place of the Muslims, who are more than 1 billion people in the world today. For this and other acts of aggression and injustice, we have declared jihad against the US.
Is the jihad directed against the US government or United States troops in Arabia? What about US civilians in Arabia or the people of the United States?
We have focused our declaration of jihad on striking at the US soldiers inside Arabia, the country of the 2 holy places, Mecca and Medina. In our religion, it is not permissible for any non-Muslim to stay in Arabia. Therefore, even though American civilians are not targeted in our plan, they must leave. We do not guarantee their safety.